Hello, my name is Michael Desch. I'm the director of the Notre Dame International Security Center and also a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. But my most august title is co-host, along with former senator, former Secretary of the Navy, former Assistant Secretary of Defense, and former Marine officer who fought in Vietnam, Jim Webb. Jim, it's great to be back with you.
Yes, and I share that thought, and all of the things we've been able to do over the last few years together, and I'm just can't say enough about Notre Dame, the mission of the university, and your particular area, the International Security Center. It's been really good working with you and doing these inside the box podcasts, and this is I think a pretty fortuitous moment for us to be discussing the situation, sort of past, present, and future with in the Ukraine war, and also doing that with Doug Bandow, who has been with us before. And I think we put together on this podcast a pretty good summary of the issues, honestly spoken, with Ukraine, including the eminent Professor Desch's piece, which I thought was really terrific. Which
was a
really,
slow news day, so
well,
Jim
that
pulled me in.
was that was a very good look at introspective look at the Zelensky career, and making some assumptions that I think were right on, and that that situation feeds into the sorts of decisions that have been made by the Ukrainian government, I think. And with respect to Doug, he has a long history of really precise and thoughtful commentaries from some from the American Conservative, some from his position at the Cato Institute, and actually this is going to be interesting because I did the same thing you did, Mike. I went back and I read two of Doug's pieces, and to really get a little bit before and after perspective, or not quite before, but just following the events, and one of the things jumped out at me, and I'm gonna read it if I can get it here. In that piece, he mentioned General Breedlove, who four-star Air Force general, who had said early on that, quoting, "We in the West have to decide that Ukraine and its future is to be determined by Ukrainians, and we need to keep our nose out of it." Okay. We need to support their decision and help them move forward. And then he said, or as Doug outlined it, he denounced, quote, "a growing group of appeasers in Washington, D.C. who were pushing for a diplomatic outcome." And, when I read that, I kind of took myself back to when it really was a hard decision to make. But when I wrote the first major piece before the invasion of Iraq, 5 months before the invasion, basically said, this is going to be a strategic blunder. It is going to empower Iran. It's going to empower China, and we should not do it. And the people who are doing it aren't talking about exit strategies because they don't intend to leave. And that's the sort of thing that seems to happen when the Americans overcommit at the very beginning of a lot of these issues, and then get stuck with okay, what do we do now? And Doug has written a very good piece outlining just that sort of situation that we're in. And so it's my pleasure that you're here on this show, Doug, and we look forward to discussing this issue with you.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity. It's always fun to Come on with you two.
So a lot has happened in the world recently. The title of your most recent piece is "The Biden Administration Has No Definition of Victory in Ukraine." And of course, uh, uh, I Jim remembers 1968 better than I do, but you can't help but feel like we're back in 1968. President Biden has gone from being the presumptive Democratic nominee to, like Lyndon Johnson, stepping back. There was an assassination attempt on another candidate, and the Democratic convention is in Chicago. What were they thinking, Jim, at the DNC? Having
Oh man,
the Democratic convention in Chicago. It
that was
went
quite a
so
year.
well the first time.
I shouldn't be laughing.
Well, if you weren't laughing, you'd be crying.
The interesting thing, and maybe we can lead this with from Doug. In terms of jumping in with both feet in the Ukraine situation, one of the things that jumped out at me at the very beginning was that since this is kind of goes to what you're saying, Mike, this 1968 situation where the president of the United States called the leader of Russia a war criminal. He called him a war criminal. And if you are trying to intercede in any way in a situation like the initial invasion of Ukraine, what you first want to do with your potential adversary or with Ukraine's adversary is to find the rabbit hole through which that other side will want to go down so that you can negotiate this and undo it. And Doug, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's right. That from the start, the U.S. made it pretty clear there was going to be no negotiated solution. I mean, there was a refusal to negotiate with Putin ahead of time on the issue. The immediate kind of moralizing of the conflict. Putin was wrong in making the attack, of course, but to turn this into a moral crusade makes it very hard to find any pragmatic solution. And then the evident opposition by the US, UK, and others to even the early negotiations strikes me as essentially an all or nothing decision that once the war started, the US and many of the Europeans saw this as an opportunity to achieve great end, to effectively destroy Russian power, potentially toss Putin out of office. People even talked about dismembering Russia, that suddenly, the war occurs, the ambitions grow, at which point it's very hard to reverse them. And of course, these have been adopted by the Ukrainians. So we're in a position now where privately, a lot of policymakers seem to acknowledge victory by Ukraine is very unlikely, but it's very hard for anyone to say that. And now the question simply is, well, we've got to keep doing what we're doing because maybe something good will happen. And somehow or another, this will increase Ukrainian leverage, even as it seems to be losing territory and losing manpower. It strikes me as being a very discouraging situation.
So how so soon after Iraq and Afghanistan, which both in their own way were failures, did we talk ourselves into thinking that Ukraine would be different? I mean, not even 20 years, really, since the beginning of those two wars, that we found this war.
Well, part of it, I think, is the fact it's a proxy war. So we convinced ourselves it's costless. I mean, the argument has been made, which I find in many ways appalling, that, oh, this is a really wonderful, cost-effective war for America because the Ukrainians are weakening our chief foe. So, the people who are dying, the country that's being destroyed, we're talking about Ukrainians, isn't that wonderful? They're weakening Russia. So it's been presented almost as if, oh, it just costs us a few dollars. No big deal. We've avoided the mistake of Iraq. We haven't gone to war. We've got somebody else fighting it. essentially fighting our war. We've made it our war, but we're not the ones fighting it. Of course, that ignores the dangers of escalation, ignores the dangers of it going full scale, and it also ignores the fact that a country, Ukraine, is being destroyed in the process.
Wouldn't you, in some ways, coin this as a United States proxy war, where, looking at it from the Russian side with all of these sophisticated weapon systems coming in, and just other fingers pulling the trigger?
Yeah, I view this as a proxy war plus. I mean, the U.S. Officials have, publicly, though, anonymously at one point were talking about how we'd helped kill Russian generals and sink Russian ships. And I assume that somewhere in there that President Biden made clear that this was utter recklessness to have the U.S. crowing about its achievements. I mean, there have been stories written in the New York Times about the massive CIA presence, the intelligence presence, and a lot of discussion, somewhat oblique in Europe, about other NATO countries with forces in Ukraine that are clearly managing some of the weaponry, though not directly involved in combat. Back in 2020, candidate Biden criticized the Trump administration for not making Russia pay for allegedly providing support for the Taliban for the killing of American soldiers. Though that seemed to be a false story ultimately. But there, I mean, the number of American deaths were quite small. If that was the U.S. reaction to a handful of Americans dying, theoretically at the hands of Russia, imagine what the Russians think about the U.S. and allies pouring in sophisticated weapons and allowing those weapons to reach ever further into Russia. I think that, in some sense, the good news, in a very perverse way, is that Russia believes it's winning. So Putin has a reason not to escalate. But imagine if Russia ends up looking like it's losing. If Crimea is at risk, one can imagine Russian attitudes hardening very strongly, given the fact from their standpoint, the Allies are in fact participants in the war, even though they're not directly on the battlefield.
So the soon-to-be former President Joe Biden apparently was all in on the most unqualified confrontation with the Russians that we could have, barring direct engagement of American military personnel. What do you think is going on with the Europeans? I guess I can understand what the Baltic folks and the Poles are thinking. They've never believed that Russia would be anything other than an existential threat. But what about Germany and France? How did they get stuck on this, sort of deep engagement in the Ukraine war?
Well, it's interesting, French, the Macron initially was one who talked about the importance of keeping a dialogue open with Putin, who talked
he
about
was a big supporter of the Minsk process.
That's
and
right.
Convened the Normandy group to try to re-energize it in December of 2021, I think.
So that's the curious one, I think, where he took one position very strongly and then has completely flipped to where he's talking about the possibility of introducing NATO troops to Ukraine. I mean, that really would be an act of war. And it's hard to imagine how one could do that without Allied casualties. And even though technically they would not be subject to the Article 5 guarantee of NATO, it would be very hard to prevent and to step away from confrontation if Americans or if other Allied soldiers were being killed. I don't know if that reflects the fact he was determined to be Europe's leader, found out that no one was following him in that direction, and decided he had to flip to the other side. That at that point he can show up in the crowd and say now he's their leader. I mean, that given his personality, that would not surprise me. It's hard for me to see a different opinion. I think in Germany, part of it is the fractured government. Of all things, the Greens have turned out to be the most, kind of hawkish party in Germany. and they have the foreign ministry. And they've helped push things along. Schultz has seemed to be rather reluctant along the way. The Social Democrats, I suppose, have had some problems. Schrader, the former chancellor, was very friendly to Russia, ended up as an executive in, it was Gazprom, or one of the major, Russian, energy entities. Rather embarrassed the Social Democrats to have their former chancellor off making money in the pay of Moscow. And that may have pushed them a bit to try to be a bit tougher. Even now, he seems to have been somewhat reluctant. And the German public, the polls I've seen suggest they're not very enthused where they're at. Massive increase in energy prices, industrial recession. And you have the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, now the #2 ranking party in the polls, and it tends to be pro-Russian. So on the German side, the internal politics, I think, have gotten very dicey. And we see that elsewhere, of course. I mean, we're seeing in Slovakia and Hungary leaders who are less enthused. We're seeing in France, the rise of the National Rally Party. That, across, I think in many ways, this is a bureaucratic enterprise. The EU is run by a fairly staunch elite who do everything they can to maintain rule irrespective of what voters do. And that seems to be the case on this war. At some point, I think this could all explode across the continent.
Well, let me let me ask you a question from a sentence in your most recent piece, because it's something that I think makes us think about the uniqueness of the situation with Ukraine as opposed to the other countries in Western Europe or Central Europe too. William Burns, presently the CIA director. I worked with him for 6 years, off and on, when I was in the Senate. And I think he was absolutely the finest diplomat in the State Department that I worked with when he was Deputy Secretary of State. He could get things done. He understands, just the wide swath of all of American foreign policy. And when he was ambassador to Russia, as you wrote in your piece, he warned the administration, and I'm going to read your quote, and it's a quote from his memorandum: "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite." And actually, in his memo, he emphasized that it wasn't just the Russian elites who would put the Ukraine situation as red line situation, whether they go into NATO or not. And he said, and to finish your quote here, it's such a step would, quote, create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine. I mean, it's he, from his lips to our ears, he was saying this is something you got to deal with delicately from day one, or they should have from day one, to try to, maybe untie a Gordian knot, but to try, and what other options now do you think we have that we may have missed before? And in terms of, this has got to end, or it's going to go maybe like, no, I'm just going to say in that part of the world, it really needs to end. And I think there are people even in Ukraine who are feeling that way right now. I'm not going to speak for them.
Well, I think NATO entry remains, a very important issue, where the best thing the U.S. and allies could do is to make very clear to Russia in private conversation that we are looking for a solution, and that solution will include a promise not to bring Ukraine in. That it never made sense. I mean, what's striking is the promise was made in 2008, and then the Allies spent the following 14 years lying to the Ukrainians. I mean, every year there are these pious promises about how much we look forward to welcoming you into NATO, when it was quite clear no one in Europe wanted to go to war over Ukraine. Even in the fall of 2021, as the crisis was gathering, Lloyd Austin was wandering off to Tbilisi and Kyiv, and the Defense Department put out a press release or a statement that said he plans on telling them that we look forward to having them in NATO. I mean, this is where the crisis is approaching, where Russian troops are on the border. Even then, we're repeating a promise that it was evident no one in Europe wanted to honor.
And on the other side, Doug, I mean, not on the other side, on the other side of the battle line, you've got the importance in terms of Russian interests of Ukraine for a number of other reasons, that whether they're going to join the NATO or not. I mean, it's very complicated, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the problem here is history, it's geopolitics. I mean, the point is not, we say, well, Putin should not fear NATO. Well, that may be the case, but it's utterly irrelevant. If Vladimir Putin and the Russian elite and many of the Russian people do, they do. So, and that's what's going to determine Russian behavior, not our pious promises. And of course, today we're in a worse situation because people say we can't make an agreement with Putin, you can't trust him. Well, of course, Petro Poroshenko, Angela Merkel, and Francois Hollande have all said that the Minsk process was a fraud. They all agreed to those terms just to give time to Ukraine to rearm. So suddenly we have now announced that the agreement we made with Russia, that we plan to violate from the start, on top of violating the assurances that were given to prior Russian governments over NATO expansion. So this is going to require a willingness to take Russian security interests into account. And this isn't, the world is not fair, or life is not fair, as Jimmy Carter, once pronounced. What's happened to Ukraine is awful, but the best that can be done, I think, is to try to salvage the situation now, prevent further losses, and basically preserve Ukrainian independence with a promise of military neutrality. It's what Finland did after World War II. It was uncomfortable at times, but it preserved Finland democracy. And today, Finland, of course, has joined NATO. Finland is fully independent, does what it wants. To my mind, that's what we want with Ukraine. End the war, preserve Ukrainian sovereignty, ensure that it can make its own economic choices, but that's going to require a promise to stay out of any military competition.
I mean, what you say makes such eminent good sense. I'm sort of wondering why, we didn't figure that out before the war or in the early months of the war. And one thing that occurs to me is maybe we're prisoners of some historical analogies that we can't get past. And I have thought for some time that the politics of the Ukraine war seemed a lot like the politics of the Spanish Civil War before World War II. Your point about the Greens being among the more militant political groups in Germany, but you see it with President Biden as well. It really is the war that people on the left of the political spectrum can get behind. And I'm wondering if you'd agree that there are two elements. One is, the international element. We think Putin is the second coming of Adolf Hitler, and if we appease him on Ukraine, he's going to take the Sudetenland or, whatever other piece of territory you want to get. The other thing, though, is like the Spanish Civil War, I wonder if Russia and Ukraine isn't also deeply implicated in domestic politics, that there is a big domestic political fight that a lot of people see as being at stake. And this, really, I think, explains a lot of the the politics of the first Trump administration. You think there's anything to that, Doug?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on here. I think one, certainly the mindset of Munich. I mean, Madeleine Albright once said that her viewpoint was Munich. So everything she did, she saw as Munich. And of course, Munich was a unique situation. It was terrible, but appeasement, of course, a little appeasement in August 1914 might have prevented World War I.
right?
So the point is, appeasement itself is not wrong. Trying to appease somebody who cannot be appeased is a problem. And that's what happened with Hitler. But of course, nobody realized that at the time. Hindsight is beautiful. The one person in Europe in 1939 who wanted the war, tragically, was Chancellor of Germany. But to act as if, I mean, everyone, suddenly it's Ho Chi Minh is Hitler. And, I mean, every dictator along the way gets, suddenly it becomes Yugoslavia and Iraq, and everybody else is ruled by Hitler. Obviously, Putin is not Hitler. I mean, I've written about, he's been head of Russia for 25 years. He hasn't done very much. He's what? Got the Donbass, and you can argue what, claim to South Ossetia and Abkhazia, got Crimea back. This is the Hitler? Come on. And now he's supposedly launching an invasion to the Atlantic and going to seize. I mean, this is such nonsense. It makes no sense, but it's this mindset. I think second, you're right, that the weird politics in the US, I mean, the Republican Party always had the foreign policy credential in the Cold War, and that was anti-Moscow. And it's proved very hard to give up the anti-Moscow card. While the Democrats, who are much more willing to, I hesitate to say weak on the Soviets, who were more willing to be accommodating to the Soviets. I mean, when I remember when Ted Kennedy wrote, the General Secretary Andropov and proposed that the Democrats work with, bring over Communist Party officials to talk about peace. I mean, this is ridiculous stuff. That they had a more accommodating view towards Moscow. But since, it's perceived that Trump was elected by Moscow, suddenly Democrats have a reason to hate Moscow. So suddenly they become, a leading anti-Russian party. I think that certainly has played a role. I think part of it was the fact that the Ukrainians did so well initially, it raised everybody's expectations. So suddenly it seemed possible we could rid ourselves of the Russia problem. Look at Ukraine. If Ukraine wins, Ukraine can lead to the ouster of Putin. It can lead to the democratization of Russia. Indeed, it might lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation. So this suddenly becomes the ambition. It's hard to give that all up, where we imagined we were on the cusp of victory and we weren't even having to fight. All we had to do is send some weapons over to the heroic Ukrainians and they could take care of the problem. That also made it easier. And of course, once you get entrenched in these positions, it's very hard to step back, admit you made a mistake, and look for an alternative. And I think that's where we are today.
Well, when you talk about the impact of domestic politics, from the American perspective, in my view, there is a similarity to what happened with the invasion of Iraq. There was a very tightly organized and smart group in this country that wanted to go to war with Iraq, even during the Gulf War I, and so they were ready, and they had done, not the particular group, but the people who really were looking for this situation in the Ukraine one way or the other. They were ready. They were ready to fight. And before the Iraq War, you can recall 9/11 happening, and then I remember either a day or 2 days after that, they got President Bush on the record about this is all Saddam Hussein. And we're going to go get Saddam Hussein. And, there wasn't an Iraqi on any of those planes or anything, but, that was a domestic issue here. And once these are begun, let's say the first moments that this was begun, if you're going to be a smart negotiator, the first thing you want to do is really try to get an understanding of why he did this. Why did Putin do this? And there were a lot of ultimatums that I'm not in any way apologizing for him here. It's just, but he had given a lot of ultimatums, and particularly like 2 months before he sent the tanks in, and they really weren't moved in there in what you could call a true battlefield formation either. It's but what does he want? what does he want? How do we go through that? And then I think as Professor Desch, wrote very well in his piece about Zelensky, once Ukraine was invaded, there are very, very strong nationalist organizations, whatever you want to call them, inside Ukraine that
Yep.
he was at risk. I mean, he can't.
Yeah.
There are certain things that he has to do, and Mike is going to give a better explanation of that than I can. But that's a domestic situation. So how does Zelensky, be what would happen if he's accused of backing away from this commitment, and what commitment can he keep unless he's got us with them?
Well, that's a very important point. I mean, Ukraine is not run by Nazis, but there are some, nasty folks there who are rabid nationalists and violent. They were, active in the Maidan Revolution. They've made threats against Zelensky, and they're willing to use force, and that has to have some impact within the process.
So, seems to me, we could talk maybe about a couple of issues. One would be the outline of a reasonable peace deal. Doug had mentioned neutrality, and then the elephant in the room is the current pre-1991 territory of Ukraine that Russia occupies. And then the other thing, sort of continuing this stream that Jim brought up, is the domestic politics in each of the major actors. Certainly, there's domestic politics within Ukraine that constrain President Zelensky to some extent. But it would also be good to talk about how you see and how Jim sees the presidential campaign being affected by this issue as well. Candidate Trump, former President Trump, has promised to settle this as the first order of business once he's sworn in. Where does Kamala Harris stand on this as well? And so maybe let's talk just a little bit about the outlines of the deal. So do we all agree with security neutralization of Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely necessary. I don't see a peace deal without it.
What do you think, Jim?
Well, let me start by saying that when I was in the Pentagon, I did a lot of work with NATO. That was one of my jobs when I was Assistant Secretary of Defense. Looking at the Soviet war plans, how do we mobilize, et cetera. And I came away from that with a strong belief after the fall of the Soviet Union that we should not expand NATO. NATO was a security alliance. A lot of people think NATO was a direct result of the end of World War II. It wasn't. It actually was the final result of the Berlin airlift, in which my father flew in 1949, 4 years later, when they saw that, okay, this is an expansionist Russia, Soviet Union, and we, there were some guarantees. Maybe there weren't formal guarantees, but I don't think that when the Soviet Union fell, I think the message that was given to Russia is, we're not going to go into your buffer areas here with an expansion of a security agreement. And I opposed them the whole time when I was on Foreign Relations Committee, when they would come in and they want another one and another one, with all due respect to some of these countries that are now NATO members that have really shown that they are willing to take military action. So we're talking about, number one, a situation that we should narrow to our national security objectives in that part of the world with respect to Ukraine. And we got to set this NATO. It's going to be hard for them to do. You saw this, the NATO grouping over here, and they were like exactly what you're saying, both of you. Before it was like, okay, we promise this is going to happen. We promise this is going to happen, and they kind of did the same thing again.
Yes,
And there's a corruption issue inside Ukraine, number one, but it's what how do we want to resolve this? I can't get you a knit by pick pattern on this, but I think we should be getting the appropriate people over into or communicating with Russia and also privately with Ukraine. This is where I would start with this, and basically saying, people, there's got to be a way to do this, and there's got to be a way to do this that doesn't really destroy the Ukrainian government either. That's the starting point.
Do you think, Doug, that almost all the NATO members have signed bilateral security arrangements with Ukraine? Is this maybe a way to finesse the NATO issue by saying, okay, you've got these worthless pieces of bilateral security agreement. Ipso facto, we can take NATO membership off the table. Do you think, there might be some method to that madness?
Well, the problem, of course, is Ukrainians recognize that's a fig leaf. None of them. I mean, what's striking to me about NATO today is, the Baltic countries talk about imposing no-fly zones and sweeping the Black Sea of Russian ships. But of course, they have between them, I don't know, 6 airplanes and 5 boats. I mean, they won't be doing this. Who do they expect to carry out their great plans? Of course, it's America. And frankly, that's the Ukrainian view. I mean, Poland, I think, is clearly moving up and very serious about its military spending. But who really expects that Germany would be doing this? Or so the problem, I think, is the Ukrainians have to be prepared to accept that they will not have the security guarantee they want, which is American nuclear weapons behind them. I mean, that's ultimately what they hope for. And to me, this needs to be communicated to them. And I think Jim is right. This is for private discussion. And I don't think we tell the Ukrainians what to do. What we tell the Ukrainians is what we are prepared to do. And they have to make decisions accordingly.
And the danger in NATO membership is Article 5.
That's right.
Of the NATO Charter. It's not just that they've got other countries backing them. It's an automatic trigger if one of these countries has been invaded in any way. That's what we don't want. We've already we recently made security guarantees to Ukraine in certain conditions, bilateral, and we would, I assume, stand by that depending on what's going on. But NATO is, it was, very carefully designed at the outset, and we're filling it up with people. Before we lose time, Mike, do you mind if I ask another question here? It's from your article, Doug, because this is, if we look downstream here strategically in a larger strategic way of what are the United States security concerns across globally, and how are other countries looking at them? I'm going to quote you. I fully agree with what you're saying here. By placing Moscow and the West at increasing odds, the war has turned Russia into an enemy of America's global interests and pushed Moscow into the arms of the West's foes. Russia is tightening its embrace with China, trading arms with Iran, North Carolina, actively combating U.S. influence in Africa, all of which are on the other side, all those countries in Africa, none of them are supporting us. Neither is India, by the way, and building support within the global South. Is that the long-term future of Russia? at this point?
Well, I think if we're thinking in terms of a renewed Cold War that this could endure, that we're going to maintain sanctions, that we hope for a conflict that continues, that we plan on continuing to ship weapons that attack Russia, we should not be surprised if Russia responds in any way possible. I worry a lot about North Korea. No one knows what they're giving North Korea in return for missiles and lots of artillery ammo, but I assume it's more than money and food. And the most obvious thing the Russians could do is help North Korea with targeting ICBMs on America. That's the last thing that North Korea needs to create a genuine nuclear deterrent against America. Well, from a Russian standpoint, the US is helping kill Russians. Why not? And I worry that we don't see, we complain and whine about this, that, oh, there's a summit, how dare Russia do this? But of course, this is the obvious response to the US position in Ukraine, which is to fight Proxy War.
And in addition to the military comment you're making, it looks at a future linkage among these countries, and in the global South and in Africa, in commercial terms, cultural terms, and even currency terms. And I don't think the United States is really stepping up to what they see. We tend to militarize everything since 9/11.
And these linkages reach beyond, I mean, for example, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey. Turkey's a NATO member, but Turkey is involved in trade with Russia. Turkey's an entree point for flights into Moscow. Turkey is involved in breaking US sanctions. India cheerfully buys lots of discounted, oil. I mean, the Saudis and Emiratis have a lot of dealings with Russia. So all of this is happening. We've created a premium for other countries to deal with Russia, and especially where a lot of them are, shall we say, rather cynical towards the West's pretensions of moral superiority when they see the U.S. invades Iraq and then suddenly is outraged by a country that violates international law by invading another country. That doesn't go over very well in the global South.
Yeah, and it'd be one thing if it was just North Korea and Iran. But, Jim's point before that you're sort of expanding on is that it's broader than that. It's the global South and important major players like Brazil and India who are not fully on the NATO reservation on this particular issue. And I wonder if the problem is that we're only talking to people who agree with us in the Atlantic world, particularly in Eastern Europe, and we're not giving, due regard to global opinion on this issue, where I think we're getting less support than we think we should get.
Well, I think Washington and its allies were shocked when they found that when they insisted that everyone should follow our lead, that suddenly we looked behind us and they weren't there. I mean,
Right.
Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country. It hosted the G7. It wanted to invite Vladimir Putin. I mean, Indonesia was not interested in joining the Western bandwagon. I mean, that's a very significant point. Indonesia matters. It's a major country. It's going to be growing economically and in influence. They're not with us on this issue. I think India is the really critical. I mean, India has a bad relationship with China. We look to India to help counterbalance China, but India has a good relationship with Russia. It's clearly looking at Russia to help counterbalance China. And Modi has made it very clear he's not following us, in some kind of anti-Russian crusade.
Yeah, India and Vietnam. Vietnam, 100 million people. It's not a small country anymore. They both have a long history with Russia, with the Soviet Union during that period. And, they welcomed Putin with open arms. Vietnam did as well. I mean, these are people, countries looking for balance. And most of them, if you take a look at who is aligned with us on this, are not in agreement with how this is being done. There's got to be a way to fix it to protect what we have started in terms of supporting Ukraine, but we need to get out of this, and they need to get out of this. I think, man, look at manpower in Ukraine right now. I mean, it's just incredible.
Yeah, the desperate conscription measures. I mean, people are fighting on the street to rescue people being grabbed by uniformed soldiers. I
Yeah.
mean, this is a very real problem. I mean, what do, you know, where your population doesn't want to serve, where, you know, I mean, there's soldiers who are in the lines have had no rest, have
Yeah.
had no rotation. You can't, I mean, this is a military that could break, you know, if you're not providing soldiers with the reinforcement you need.
And the casualties have been enormous.
Yeah.
Bigger, I think, than you know, we're willing to publicly admit. Of course, the key question, we're in the midst of a very tumultuous presidential election, is how you guys see this playing in the run-up to November 4th. How much of this is going to be part of the Trump-Vance campaign? And is there any possibility that Vice President Harris or, you know, what remains of the anti-war Democratic Party might rethink this issue? What do you inside the Beltway guys think about this?
Well, actually, Jim lives within the Beltway. I'm just outside. So I tell everyone none of this is actually my fault. Look, I think that the Trump and Vance clearly offer an alternative. Now, no, I tried to figure out where Donald Trump's going to come down on this. Yeah, I mean, he plans on solving this in one day. I mean, I don't know exactly what that means. Nevertheless, I think there at least there's real openness to doing something differently, especially because, I mean, one can imagine that Trump, I think, will take the attitude towards Biden that he took towards Obama. His job was to reverse everything that his predecessor did,
Right.
and policy towards Ukraine will be part of that. I think Harris is the interesting question. It's going to be, she's in, you know, Humphrey's position. It's very hard for her to criticize the incumbent president and his policies while she's running to replace him. So I think she's, until, you know, November at least, she has to reflect essentially Biden-Harris administration policy. But if she wins, then I do think that she's free in taking office to say, you know, I mean, it was heroic, the role that President Biden played in saving Ukraine from being overrun. But now we have to take another look at blah, 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 you know, and coming up with a willingness to do something differently and to be approaching allies and saying this has got to change, and to be telling the Ukrainians we've got to look for an out. So I think she has that option. Now, this is not somebody who's known for her foreign policy, you know, views. So again, who will be advising her? I assume it won't
Right.
be Sullivan and Blinken, but I don't know who it will be. You know, and that matters a lot.
Well, okay, let me give this a go. since I live just inside the Beltway. You know, I think if you look at first her situation, assuming that she actually is going to be the nominee and who she chooses as a vice presidential candidate, if you're a leader and if you're looking at this, and you know, they right now, I mean, it's closer than a lot of people think. I mean, the margin between Trump and whoever the Democrat would be, but you need to state what your beliefs are to the country. That's what people are wanting to hear, you know. And there is a way, you know. I mean, she doesn't have to lay out in detail. There is a way. There is a way, and we're going to find a way, because you know we need to protect the interests that we have put Ukraine at risk in, but at the same time, this has to be resolved, and I will put something together. And particularly in the Democratic side there, if you really want to get a feel for where that administration would go, you need to look at the next tier. Who are the people they're going to appoint, or are they going to keep these people? And if they're going to keep these people, you better be telling them you want something different. Now, on the Republican side, this is hard because, first of all, when I don't know Donald Trump, never met Donald Trump, but he has a tendency to speak in superlatives, good and bad. And when you're dealing with something that is this fragile? You don't do that. That was Biden's biggest mistake right after Putin went in. You don't call Putin a war criminal and think you're going to get anything out of it. I think just when I hear Trump say, I'll solve that in one day, and maybe in his mind, he remembers what Ronald Reagan did when we had all these hostages in Iran, and Jimmy Carter, the Carter administration, had tried to go and rescue him, and it was a debacle. But we had those hostages there, and Ronald Reagan said, they are coming out. And I remember I was out hunting actually in the woods near Quantico, bird hunting, and when Reagan took the oath of office, B-52s flew over Iran, and all those hostages came home. Now that's kind of unique. That's getting American hostages out. That's not changing the whole formula. I mean, he may want to try this, but the one thing that I would hope for him and also for his vice presidential nominee is don't put your superlative BS into the equation at the beginning. You can put your intentions into words that are powerful, that people can understand, whether they agree with you or not. And I think too many Republicans feel like they're in a box on Ukraine. Once you're in, how do you get out? That's really what you're seeing right now. And a leader can do it.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Well, the question is, do we have such a leader? I think the depressing thing about where we're at in American politics is there isn't that obvious leader on either side of the aisle in this case. Any other issues or questions, Jim, you want to ask, or should we wrap it up?
I think this is a great show, and I really appreciate Doug coming to be with us again. And here's hoping. This is it's such a timely issue right now. I'm glad we had a chance to discuss it.
Yeah,
I think that there's at least a slight hope here. That is that both we have a Republican and a presumptively Democratic candidate, both of whom actually have an incentive and a reason to try to get out of the box. Now, whether they can figure it out, whether they're able to do it, is something different. But I do think that because Kamala Harris can start afresh. And from her standpoint, it'd be better to start afresh. She doesn't want to look to 4 years of fights, of aid to Ukraine and all the problems with Russia. So that at least is my hope, is that once the election is decided, however it is, both sides are going to say, okay, how do we unload this? How do we get rid of the albatross? What's the answer? And let's just hope they have some people around them who can give them good answers.
Well, and I hope too that the discussion, starts to emphasize the human cost that the Ukrainians are suffering as a result of being used as cannon fodder in a proxy war, because even the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers who are being killed increasingly are being killed to no good purpose. And it seems to me that it's a lot of discussion of the moral side of Putin's invasion of Russia, but there is the other side of the moral coin, which is that at some point, the cost of this war has exceeded any conceivable benefits, and that there's a moral imperative for shutting it down. And I hope that those of us who believe that don't cede the moral high ground in discussion of this, this terrible situation.
Well, I would hope. I'm sorry.
Please.
Yeah, I would hope if this is done in the right way, both sides can come out without totally losing face. I think that's potentially doable. Neither side's going to get 100% of what their rhetoric was saying, but I mean, there's a way to undo this with good leadership.
Yeah. From your lips to God's ears, Senator Webb. So on that happy note, Doug, thank you very much. Jim, always a pleasure.
Thanks, Mike.
Working with you on this, and Jim, I look forward to chatting with you about the book when you
at another time.
Yeah,
I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and
Doug,
also an update on young Georgia. And,
oh my God, yeah, that's a long conversation, but everything is finally done. We will bring her August 25th. We'll bring her to Italy, to Rome. And she's really, really excited about it. So,
well, she should be. So, great.
And Doug, as always, good to talk to you.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Take care now. Bye-bye.